The suicides of American designer Kate Spade and the celebrity chef Anthony Bourdain have drawn people's attention once again to the scourge of depression in daily life. In today's society, it seems people are facing mounting pressures and competition, and these pressures take a toll on mental health. So what is the general picture of depression in modern society? What do we know about causes and consequences for mental health? And what can be done to improve the social system to minimize negative impacts? To discuss these issues and more, I'm very happy to be joined in the Beijing studio by Robert N. Portnoy, Chief Supervisor of the Mental Health Service Center in the Faculty of Psychology at Beijing Normal University, Harvey Zordin, Research Fellow of the Center for China and Globalization, and Professor Teng Dimeng of Beijing Foreign Studies University. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. But before we get started, let's take a look at this.
From time to time, the news of celebrity suicide brings the issue of mental health to the fore. But it's not only the famous facing the tremendous pressure of depression. Ordinary people are also at risk. According to the WHO, the incidence of depression in China is just over 3%, meaning that more than 40 million people are now struggling with depression. However, in sharp contrast, less than 10% of the patients were admitted, and more than 90% did not receive professional treatment. Depression is now the fourth most widespread disease in the world, and is expected to overtake cancer by 2020 as the second most.
Welcome back. Gentlemen, as a real expert of psychological studies with the Beijing Normal University, what have you discovered about the real causes behind the suicide of the two celebrities in the United States?
Well, I think we're in a situation where we have limited information in the case of the death by suicide of Anthony Bourdain. All indications were that everything was going positively in his life. He had a girlfriend. People who knew him described him as being very happy. So frankly, it remains a mystery. Regarding Kate Spade, there were indications from family members that she had been struggling with bipolar disorder, what used to be called manic depressive disorder, for quite some time, and despite lots of encouragement had been refusing to seek treatment. And so I think what we know is that the major mood disorders like depression and bipolar disorder can have some very serious and unfortunately fatal consequences.
Quite a few years ago, I was able to interview yet another American expert of suicide studies. He said, in most cases about the tragic suicide stories, just 5 minutes ago, these guys made up their mind to end their lives through suicide. Is that true through your studies?
Well, I haven't done research, but in my clinical experience, oftentimes suicide is an impulsive decision, but again, it's difficult to generalize because there's so many factors that go into the decision to end one's life. And so we know that there are, in many cases, mental illness, specifically mood disorders, but other mental illnesses too that can contribute to the decision to end one's life. It clouds one's judgment, it creates a sense of hopelessness, and all of these and many other factors can contribute. So yes, it's often impulsive, but not always, certainly not always.
Well, these few years, China sees a surge in suicide rate. You know why? Because of the suspicions of corrupt government officials. They've been put on charges of corruption, so they committed suicide. They jumped from the building. But that's the Chinese picture. What about the alleged rise in suicide rate in the United States? Is that true that more and more famous, public figures or ordinary folks in the United States choose to kill themselves this way?
It's not only public figures, Jan Ray. It's a broad swath of the population, and not only in the United States, but in the world. Why? The world's getting more complicated. There's more pressure in the world these days. People have to compete more to perform better. And so depression is caused when people can't take it, when they're overwhelmed. So in America, yes, there is more depression, and there are a lot of suicides. But the same, you could say, is true in China as well. China is increasing in the number of suicides, cases of depression, and people think it's only in the cities. But it's not only in the cities. By a 3-to-1 ratio in the countryside, there's more depression than there are in the cities. By a 3-to-1 ratio, more women than men are depressed. And there's actually a suicide belt in China, in Yangtze River Basin, that's 40% higher than the rest of China. And it's not only young people, it's old people as well. And I think there's reasons for both of those age groups.
And do you see eye to eye with the analysis of Harvey about the rising suicide cases along the Yangtze River Basin area? I mean, what should be the driving force, the bad driving force behind the rise?
Well, in general, I think I agree. I think rural women are basically having the highest number in terms of committing suicide. I mean, mostly because they are left behind by men, by their husbands, and by basically family members. They are left behind to do the hard labor, taking care of the children and also the parents. But then,
is that also because of the easy access to the use of the pesticides?
Right, because they do farm work and they have easy access to these farming pesticide, and most importantly, I think that the easy exposure to these actually has been always a risk factor for this suicide on the part of the women. But in the United States, once again, I think it's women, and it's also recent figures indicates that young children and girls in between the age of 13 to 17 committed suicides, and because of stress, various kinds of stress, health worries, family stress, social stress, all contributes to that. Perhaps we have different reasons. China poverty, for example, disease, they all became risk factors.
Or poor execution of justice, because we don't have a perfect rule of law in this country. Now, we've had said enough about the problems that emerged in recent years in our two countries, but what about our approach to clarify, to figure out what is the clinical depression, or what is the usual sense of sadness?
Yeah, that is an important distinction, because I think people often do confuse that. So sadness is a basic human experience. Everyone experiences sadness at points in their life. They will continue to experience it throughout their life, because there are going to be setbacks. There are going to be situations in which people don't achieve what they had set out to achieve, relationships end. So this can create sadness. But the thing about sadness is there's always a specific precipitant to sadness. There's something that causes it that can be identified. And typically it tends to lift within a period of a week or two, even without any intervention.
Like the hazardous fog that lifts usually in capital city Beijing. We are all victims, the beneficiaries of the improvement or the decline in air quality.
Yes. Right, and that's to be contrasted with clinical depression or major depressive disorder, in which we have a more pervasive mind-body effect. The thoughts, the feelings, the behaviors, the physical body actually shuts down. There's a lack of pleasure in what in the past had been pleasurable activities, what we call anhedonia, a lack of pleasure. There are typically suicidal thoughts that occur. Of course, that can occur with sadness too, but typically those are more fleeting emotions rather than something that dominates one's day and week.
Sadness is a common problem for ordinary folks. Have you guys honestly tell me, have you ever had a fleeting moment of wanting to commit suicide in your life?
No, I never had that. But when I was young, about 12 or 13 years old, there were a few weeks when I was clinically depressed, didn't go to school, had a lot of those symptoms that Dr. Portnoy explained, and happily got over it. But it's not something that's pleasant to experience.
Was that because of the drug addiction or whatever? Setback in your love affairs?
I was addicted to food then as I am now.
So, did you ever have such a moment of
Well, no. I mean, if you
suicide?
look at the Chinese culture, I mean, suicide has always been a kind of a very bad idea, a stigma attached to someone. I mean, it's almost like a sin against God if Buddhism or the Japanese samurai culture, I mean, would accept that. I mean, but there was deeply sad moment, I mean, in my life, and perhaps I believe in all our lives. But then, once again, that deeply rooted cultural element, I mean, that very risk factors, and especially during the Cultural Revolution. I mean, basically, I spent my formative years during the Cultural Revolution. I mean, during the Cultural Revolution, Mao said committing suicide is counter-revolutionary. I mean, basically, you are committing a crime against the people, against the nation, and so nobody would think about that idea.
But his chief secretary committed suicide in his office.
Well, that was a different story, perhaps a different kind of pressure. I mean, as common people, I mean, we basically are educated, emulating all these heroes. We have too many heroes and models to emulate. And so, in a sense, this commonly shared culture, like the Japanese samurai culture, unlike the Japanese samurai culture, we never think suicide is an honest act in our life.
What about the relevance of a gun culture in your country? FBI reports that an average of 30,000 people committed or died of gun-related violence. Some of that could go to suicide with the...
Not some of it. 20,000 out of the 30,000 have gone to suicides. 10,000.
Ernest Hemingway killed himself with a pistol, and so did Jack London, perhaps. These two famous writers from the United States of America.
America's out of control. I was in Chicago a couple weekends ago for Memorial Day. There were 39 shooting incidents in Chicago. 9 people died. I was so afraid when I went from the subway to University of Chicago by foot because there was a shooting there just the night before. We have an epidemic in America, and it's part of the American discussion now that's dividing the country profoundly, the gun rights versus gun control.
I think there's a telling set of statistics that address the issue that Harvey is talking about, and that is that I just retired last year after 25 years as the director of counseling services at the University of Nebraska, and so I was used to working with students. And in the college-age population, basically 16 to 24, in the general population, the suicide rate is roughly 15 per 100,000. In the college population, the folks who are actually in university and college, half of that, 7.5. Wow. And sometimes we pat ourselves on the back as counselors, saying we must be doing a wonderful job as counselors to cut the suicide rate in half. But in fact, what it's largely attributable to is lack of access to firearms on campus. We outlaw firearms on campus, and it has effectively cut the suicide rate in half.
Well, that's the difference between the U.S. and China.
That's right.
We have little access to firearms.
Well, it's also the difference between American states. I think in Texas, students are allowed to carry guns.
That's right. That's
and
right.
So this is another difference, internal difference.
Right. But they're arming the teachers right now, right?
That's what Trump wants
What
to
about
do.
depression of the weather conditions in Scandinavian country? Because half of the year they have to go through permanent darkness, and I was told that Norwegians tend to commit suicide.
Well, basically what we find is the farther you go away from the equator, the greater the incidence and prevalence of what's called seasonal affective disorder. It's a form of depression, and basically it's the lack of exposure to sunlight. If people have more exposure to sunlight, they are less likely to get depression through seasonal affective depression. There may be other forms of depression that they would get, but I think that is a major contributor to the Scandinavian countries having such a high suicide rate.
Does it mean that the Sunshine State of Florida would have the least suicide rate because of the weather conditions? Everybody put on a sunshine smile.
Yeah, all other things being equal, they're not. So I would say that if you're in some little village in Florida versus the city of Miami, yeah, maybe it's so. But sunshine seems to be more than just the power of the sun to warm us. It warms our psyche as well.
And What about Japan? You spoke of Japan earlier. There was a book which was very popular and a bestseller about how to commit suicide. It's a lecture about how to kill yourself with the different weapons or instruments. That was banned by the Japanese government, by the way. But during the Second World War, many Japanese soldiers chose to kill themselves instead of surrendering to Allied troops like the United States during their wars, battles, lethal battles in some of the islands. So what do you think of the Japanese culture in this respect?
Well, the Japanese culture can be radically different from the rest of the world, especially their Buddhism, even if they call that Buddhism being imported from China, and also the samurai culture. I mean, they view suicide as a way of resolving issues, or even a form of responsibility. I mean, they kill themselves because they think that, oh, I'm basically stop being the burden to the community, or sacrificing my life for the nation. Look at the kamikaze, I mean, kind of suicidal bombers during the Second World War. I mean, even if they're scared to hell, but then they kill themselves. I mean, they kill themselves. And so in this case, like the book author, for example, The Complete Manual of Suicide, that ridiculous book banned by Japan, in fact, he would outline several of the basic principles and ways and approaches to commit suicide. For example, overdosing, jumping off the building, drowning, or cutting open one's wrist.
Don't give our viewers any ideas.
Yeah, it was bloody. It was, but then they view it as a way to relieve themselves from this very earthly world. I mean,
but I'm afraid the growing momentum in Islamic extremism may have also contributed to the surge in suicide bombings in the volatile region of the Middle East. That's viewed by the West and all other major players of international society as an act of suicide and cowardice. You are watching Dialogue with Mr. Harvey Lordin, Mr. Robert Portnoy, and Professor Teng Jimeng. We're discussing why so many people in developed countries suffer from depression, and what is the difference between clinical depression and sadness. We'll come back in a short while. Stay with us, please. Welcome back. So, I'm advised by the team to focus on the issue of depression. It seems there are a lot of reasons contributing or attributable to the killing of oneself, whether it's suicide or whatever. So what else can you tell us from your case studies?
Well, I think there are a number of factors that tend to occur time and time again when we have people who are so severely depressed or so impulsive that they make the decision to end their lives. A lack of a sense of community tends to be pretty prominent with most of these individuals.
But look at the pervasive use of the new media, the social media, smartphones. I mean, do you think this will help people alleviate the sense of loneliness and depression?
Just the opposite.
Yeah.
And
just the opposite.
That was the point I was going to get to, that people have a lack of sense of community, and then they have this false sense of community on the internet or other social media. But in fact, it is a fantasy. It's not real relationships. And as a consequence, people don't really feel connected to others, and when they're in some sort of crisis that may lead them to think about and consider suicide, they don't really have people to reach out to. They don't have a sense of support. And then also, as the professor was saying, maybe there's some other cultural issues where issue of honor, perhaps, in Japanese culture, but maybe there's a sense that suicide might be a better option. It's never a good option, I would argue, unless one is facing end-of-life like medical problems. But sometimes we had a discussion recently with a visiting professor from UC Berkeley, and he was saying, are people perhaps inclined to kill themselves in order to collect insurance? Well, that's not the case in China, that would happen, but could it happen in the U.S.? Sure, and it probably does.
I think there's a silver lining, or maybe it's a thin silver lining to this, and that is a couple things. Number one, Chinese researchers at the China Academy of Social Science have used artificial intelligence to start identifying people in social media who are prone to suicide and who are depressive, and started contacting them and trying to steer them to help. So I think in the future this will be helpful. I think social media is like fire. It's a tool that can be used for good or for ill. And I think social media can be harnessed better to make people aware of what the problems and symptoms of depression are, as well as where to go for help. It's hard to get help in some cases, but it's always there. It's even available in China. But people don't know. So if they don't know, it doesn't exist for them.
Given the stressful life coming out of competitions in urban life, Dr. Bourdain, is it a good idea for all employers to first of all recruit a counselor instead of the most skillful engineers or well-educated university graduates, so that we'll have easy access to counseling? And the second question, gentlemen, is under what circumstances is it necessary for me to go to a counselor and to seek first aid help?
Yeah, I do think, especially for the larger employers, it makes sense for them to have, I don't know what it would be called in China, but the equivalent of an employee assistance program where they have counselors who are readily available to their employees to deal with work-related issues, but also personal issues that, of course, can have an impact on their work, but can take a huge toll in their productivity at work just based upon serious mental health concerns that will interfere with their ability to even attend work. So I do think having counselors available makes a lot of sense. For smaller employers, it might not be practical to have a formal employee assistance program, but I think they can contract with different mental health agencies. Here in Beijing, I know such a thing exists. Even at BNU, we do some of this work.
We better set up a hotline with our audience in Beijing, at least, to help them. And isn't it a part of Chinese culture to feel shy with issues like poor sex of the couple, or in this context, the case of depression? The Chinese would hesitate, would give us a long second thought before they actually seek counseling from a professional.
Well, yeah, I mean, indeed, I think the Chinese general public tend to be very, very reserved in terms of sharing and open to talking about this very set of issue. And so that's why I think even if there is a lifeline, in fact, the Chinese CDC has a lifeline offered to the general public in talking about issues like that, nobody called. I think it's because the Chinese, both Chinese and the Japanese culture, they share one thing in common, and that is we are a shame culture. We feel ashamed. I mean, even if in the rural countryside, I mean, Harvey, right now, these women who suffer schizophrenia, they never talk about that. They never think that they have a polar kind of a
like
reason.
in most cases of the domestic violence, the victims of the domestic violence.
They would never talk about it.
They never talked about that. So what we see is only tip of the iceberg.
It needs to be talked about, and the government or NGOs or all of them working together have to do something to educate people, because I think education is the first step to destigmatize this kind of condition, also to let people know that there's help. I don't know if Dr. Bourdain would agree or not, but to me, in terms of depression, given that in China there's a severe lack of professionals, both psychiatrists and psychologists and related fields, to me, knowledgeable friends are very important to talk to as a stopgap. And I think the one device that is the best for helping lay people to end or to mitigate depression is this, an ear, a listening ear. I don't know if you agree with that or not.
Instead of cigar, whiskey, wine, going to music, concert, I mean, what are the solutions? All of them combined should be a very good solution to the issue of depression.
I have noticed, though, and it's pretty limited experience, so I don't want to draw broad conclusions from this, but it does seem that, at least in Beijing, that people are becoming more and more open to the idea of psychology and secondarily psychotherapy.
Oh, gay, lesbian, I mean, we used to be very shy about this issue, because One representative of Amnesty International came up to me during my short stay in Almaty, a major city of Kazakhstan. He said, well, China deserves credit for remarkable progress in at least two areas. One is the review by the Supreme People's Court of the death penalty. The other is your recognition of gay rights. I mean, they do enjoy the same rights as marriage of the different sex.
Last month, the first Chinese gay film was released. I mean, it was the first, lesbian film, or the gay film, actually, homosexual film, basically made in China and widely available by the viewing public in this country.
You put your finger on a very important issue of education. Due to the automobile culture, we have the largest number of cars on the roads. We listen to the radio. I mean, during daytime, a lot of radio calling programs during daytime, not when evening falls, when night falls. We are briefed, drivers are briefed about different diseases, illnesses of modern life in urban areas. So elders, retirees, pensioners, all could listen to such programs, and adults could also share programs that were delivered by real experts who share the expertise late at night. So do you think this is a part of the things we have learned from the West? Inspirations we have learned from the West to be really liberal, open up, and ready to accept professional advice and counseling?
I suppose. I think that exposure to Western media has had substantial impact, not just on Chinese culture, but on cultures around the world. And unfortunately, a lot of that is not good. Some of it is good.
Agree.
Thank you so much. I mean, we have to reflect upon the poor behavior of Chinese media people. We haven't done enough to give a full report and exposure of the suicide rate, the real stories. Most of the tragic stories went underreported in China.
It's a work in progress, because in America, I had a friend at Harvard School of Public Health, and he would get Hollywood to put in these themes in the programs, and it grabbed people emotionally. So I think Chinese TV and movies have to do more of this and show the consequences.
I thought you were talking about the Freudian discourse, but thank you so much for being part of this meaningful dialogue on why people suffer depression and what kind of solutions we have. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.